Have you ever noticed that the whole world seems different? It's not just politics, economics, or technology. It's something deeper, almost invisible, as if the very soul of the earth is shifting frequencies. Jesus warned about this 2,000 years ago, but what he described wasn't a mystical prophecy, it was a psychological map. And Carl Jung, centuries later, deciphered this map with almost surgical precision. While many look to the sky for signs, the real sign is happening within you. The growing anxiety, the existential emptiness, the sudden changes, none of these are random. They are the birth pangs of consciousness. And when these symptoms start to intensify, it will be too late to try to understand what is happening, because the time of explanation ends when the time of revelation begins. What comes now is not the end of the world. It is the end of an era. And those who are not internally prepared will confuse awakening with destruction. Jesus didn't talk about destruction, he talked about transition. But this transition comes at a price. It requires you to drop the mask, face your shadow, and awaken to the self that the modern world tries to numb. So before you doubt, listen, because what you're about to hear next isn't theory. It's a mirror of a time that has already begun. They say life speaks to us all the time. The problem is, most of us are too distracted to listen. The call of signs doesn't come in the form of thunder or lights in the sky. It whispers in the details, in the subtle repetitions that consciousness insists on ignoring. Carl Jung would call this synchronicity, that moment when the universe seems to conspire to wake the sleeper still living on autopilot. When spirituality becomes alive within someone, it doesn't manifest itself with mantras or rituals, but with a silent presence that begins to perceive the patterns hidden behind seemingly banal facts. It's when you realize that the people who enter and leave your life are no coincidence, that certain pains come not to punish, but to awaken. Everything that seems random is actually an attempt by the self to call you back home. The curious thing is that the shadow, that invisible territory where the soul archives what it didn't want to feel, is often the first messenger. It speaks through repetitions, crises, losses, and discomfort. And when you start listening, you realize there was nothing against you, just your own consciousness trying to expand. The problem is that many confuse the call with bad luck, resistance, or failure. They don't understand that the universe doesn't speak Portuguese, it speaks emotion. Think about how many times something inside you whispered, "Don't go," and yet you went anyway, and then the price was paid in the form of regret. This is the self trying to regain control of the journey. Carl Jung said that a person's life is a story of the soul's self-realization, and everything that happens is symbolic material for this individuation. Spirituality, when mature, teaches that even chaos has order. The problem is that human haste seeks quick results and short answers, while wisdom works in silence and patience. A good exercise is to stop looking for grandiose signs and start observing the small, the unexpected encounter, the repeated number, the sudden feeling of déjà vu. It's not cheap mysticism, it's refined attention, it's presence. A simple example: if you wake up every day tired, irritated, and procrastinating, the signal has already been given. Your body has become a prophet. The same goes for relationships that drain your energy, jobs that drain your soul, dreams you've buried under logical excuses. The call of signs is in all of this, and the more you ignore it, the louder it screams. There's something profoundly spiritual in the simple act of stopping to notice, stopping to breathe, stopping to ask yourself, what in me is asking to be seen? The shadow is like a child locked in a dark room. It doesn't want to punish you, just to be recognized. When you listen to it, the energy that once sabotaged you begins to work in your favor. Consciousness expands, presence deepens, and what once seemed like coincidence begins to reveal a pattern. It's at this point that the individual stops being a victim of events and begins to decipher their own destiny. It's when spirituality ceases to be a concept and becomes a compass. And the curious thing is that when you finally understand the signal, a new one emerges, deeper, more challenging, more revealing, because the call never ends. It simply changes tone as your individuation advances. And it's at this rhythm that life, like a great teacher, leads you to the next stage, the one in which the entire earth seems to go into labor, preparing something that requires more than open eyes. It requires an awakened soul. When Carl Jung said that everything that does not come to consciousness returns as fate, he was speaking not only of the individual psyche, but also of the collective soul. The planet today is a mirror of the human unconscious, and every earthquake, crisis, war, or collapse is the cry of something that needs to be born. Spirituality, when properly understood, does not invite us to flee from chaos, but to listen to it, because chaos is the language of transformation. What we call the end of times is perhaps just the birth of a new consciousness. The earth, saturated with neglect and unconsciousness, begins to react like a body rejecting excess. It is as if humanity's own self were forcing the birth of a new era. Pain increases in frequency and intensity, and this is frightening. But pain, in the symbolic language of the soul, is always the prelude to birth. Individual and collective consciousness intertwine in this process. While the world crumbles on the outside, there is a chance for reconstruction on the inside. It's like when life tears us away from a job, a relationship, or a predictable routine. It's not a punishment, it's a contraction. Imagine a woman in labor. Each contraction is unbearable, but each one also brings the new being closer to the light. So it is with humanity. Authentic spirituality promises not anesthesia, but meaning. Carl Jung would understand this moment as an archetype of the crossing, the collapse of old structures that no longer support current consciousness. The financial system, religions, governments, everything is shaking because they were built on values that ignored the soul. The collective shadow is emerging, demanding recognition, and ironically, many interpret it as evil growing, when in fact, it is the unconscious itself being illuminated. Fear arises because the ego cannot bear the unpredictable, but it is precisely the unpredictable that activates presence. When you find yourself without control, without certainty, you are forced to look within. This is the first step to individuation, accepting that life is not crumbling, it is giving birth, and the more you resist the pain, the longer it lasts. The earth's pain is also the pain of the human soul trying to remember who it is. Observe the climate catastrophes, the emotional breakdowns, the rise in anxiety, the desperation for meaning. All these are symptoms of the same crisis, the separation between humankind and the self. External nature and internal nature are in sync, both crying out for reconnection. If the planet bleeds, it's because we've distanced ourselves from presence. And while science seeks physical causes, spirituality invites introspection. Want to see the world improve? Start with the territory you can heal, your own shadow. Practice silence, walk barefoot, read something that awakens consciousness. Man and his symbols, for example. These small gestures are like breaths in the birth of the collective soul. Each awakening accelerates the expansion of the new world. And when the pain seems unbearable, remember, it's the self pushing you out of the womb of ignorance. And it is precisely in this push that the next chapter is revealed, the one in which the spirit realizes that not everyone can bear the birth, and many, unable to look within, prefer to desert their own faith. Every process of individuation begins with a crisis of faith, not a religious faith, but that silent trust in one's own presence, in the self that guides within when everything outside seems to be crumbling. And it is precisely at this point that many give up. Carl Jung said that people will do anything, absolutely anything, to avoid facing their own soul. And that is what we see now, a mass spiritual desertion. Churches are emptying, but the real void is not in the temples, but in the consciousness. People have grown tired of doctrines that promise salvation but don't teach self-knowledge. They want shortcuts, and so they run to false teachers. The internet is full of them. They sell enlightenment in 7 steps, promise instant healing of the shadow, transform spirituality into emotional marketing. And the most dangerous thing is that they tell the ego what it wants to hear, that there is nothing to transform, that everything is fine as it is. This is the perfect anesthesia for the soul that fears the pain of inner labor. The true master, on the other hand, does not console the ego. He confronts it. Desertion isn't just abandoning faith, but trading depth for convenience. It's easier to follow those who talk nicely than those who point inward. It's more comfortable to watch high-vibration videos than to look in the mirror. Carl Jung would say, we're experiencing an inflation of the spiritual ego, a phenomenon in which the individual believes they've achieved consciousness simply by repeating lofty words. But true awakening isn't glamorous. It requires silence, solitude, deconstruction. The shadow needs to be traversed, not recited. Genuine spirituality is almost always uncomfortable because it exposes what was repressed. It's like that rare friendship that doesn't spare you the truth, even knowing it will anger you. Have you ever had someone like that? Well, yes. The soul needs that kind of friendship too. And the self, like that friend, insists on revealing what the ego tries to hide. The problem is that in the information age, lies are more attractive because they're more marketable. But there's a detail that goes unnoticed by those who desert. The shadow doesn't disappear simply because it's been ignored. It disguises itself. And when a person abandons the sincere search for consciousness, they become hostage to false inner teachers, fear, pride, and self-deception. This is why so many claim to be awake, yet live trapped in the same emotional repetitions. Spiritual awakening isn't about changing beliefs, it's about shifting focus. It's about leaving the ego in the passenger seat and allowing the self to lead. Carl Jung saw this as a heroic act, stepping out of the inner crowd and following the voice few hear. But this journey exacts a price. It requires detachment from comfortable narratives and the courage to question even what seems sacred. This is why, while many abandon the path, a small group remains steadfast, like an incandescent remnant carrying the original fire of consciousness. And it's about this small group, silent, faithful and awake, that the next chapter speaks. While many extinguish their inner flame out of fear, fatigue or convenience, there is always a small group that remains lit. Carl Jung would call this group of awakened souls the remnant of consciousness, those who resist the temptation to fall asleep when the entire world surrenders to spiritual slumber. This remnant is a living testimony of presence. They don't preach, they don't impose, they simply radiate. They are ordinary people with discreet lives, but they carry a silent and authentic spirituality. They don't call themselves enlightened, but their actions reveal a kind of light that needs no stage. And it's curious to see how the self acts through them. They effortlessly transform the environment simply by being whole. In times of false teachers and mass defections, these souls become beacons amidst the fog. They don't need to convince anyone, because truth doesn't convince, it's contagious. They understand that consciousness is not about individual salvation, but about reminding humanity of what it has forgotten. These remnants spread silently across the four corners of the world, artists who create works that awaken, doctors who heal with compassion, teachers who teach with soul, young people who question the obvious. Each one is a spark that reignites the original fire of human individuation. Carl Jung said that what heals the world is the individual who manages to become whole, and that is exactly what these beings do. They are living proof that spirituality is not belief, it is coherence. It is living what one knows, and coherence today is the true miracle. Look around you. How many talk about love but react with hate? How many preach freedom but live enslaved by approval? These remnants are not perfect, but they are true, and this makes them dangerous in a world that idolizes masks. They do not seek followers, they seek mirrors. And when one mirror meets another, an invisible network of light is born that crosses borders, religions, and cultures. It is the silent revolution of the self. But there is something deeper to all this. The testimony of the remnant is not made of words, but of vibration. Their presence is the sermon. And this presence awakens a dormant force in those who perceive it. It is as if the soul remembers, I too came from the same light. This remembrance is the true revelation, the moment when consciousness ceases to be theoretical and becomes a living experience. And it is precisely there that the symbolic plane intersects with the historical, because this inner expansion has concrete repercussions. The fire of consciousness begins to touch forgotten territories, and the ancient center of the spiritual world, Jerusalem, returns to movement as a prophetic and psychic axis. Not coincidentally, where there is greater external conflict, there is also greater internal movement. The collective shadow lifts, and the sacred stage of human history trembles again. It is the sign that the incandescent remnant has fulfilled its function, to rekindle the flame. And now, the light once again points to the epicenter of prophecy. In every spiritual narrative, there is a point where symbol and geography become one. Jerusalem is that point. It is not just a city, it is the mirror of the collective unconscious, the archetypal heart where the forces of light and shadow meet in eternal conflict. Carl Jung would say that Jerusalem represents the psychic center of humanity, the self on a global scale. And when this center is convulsed, the entire world feels it. Wars, religious disputes, political crises, all of these are the external manifestation of an inner battle raging within the human soul. Jerusalem is the map of our own consciousness, divided, sacred, desired, wounded. Every conflict out there reflects an internal conflict within. When we see hatred and intolerance explode in that land, it is the collective shadow of humanity being projected, calling for reconciliation. And until this axis finds peace, we will not find it either. Because, spiritually, Jerusalem is not in the Middle East, it is in our midst. Deep spirituality understands that the sacred is not limited to stone temples, but manifests itself in awakened consciousness. And yet, humanity insists on rebuilding outside what needs to be reborn within. Carl Jung would explain this impulse as the archetypal projection of the self. We try to materialize the divine because we cannot bear to feel it within ourselves. This is why, for centuries, we have tried to build temples, cathedrals, and monuments. They are concrete mirrors of what we have abandoned within. Jerusalem, in this sense, is a constant reminder that true peace will not come through treaties, but through a transformation of consciousness. The city that the world observes with fear and fascination is, in fact, the living symbol of collective individuation. A call to integrate opposites, reconcile dualities, and redeem the shadow. When you seek to control your own mind, you're trying to pacify your inner Jerusalem. And perhaps when humanity finds peace within, the geopolitical map will finally align with the spiritual map. But there is something mysterious about the times we live in, something that makes this ancient prophecy resonate. The world's attention is turning to Jerusalem as if an invisible force were pulling it to center stage. And it's no coincidence. Spirituality teaches that when a symbol repeats itself in history, it is about to manifest again on another level of consciousness. Political movements, agreements, religious tensions, all of these are visible expressions of an awakening archetype. Carl Jung would call this collective synchronicity, the mirror of the psyche reflecting itself on a global scale. The self of humanity attempts to reorganize itself, and the epicenter of this realignment vibrates at the same frequency as the ancient temple. But here's the secret. The true temple is not made of stone, it is built in consciousness. And when this inner temple rises in enough hearts, what seemed like prophecy will become revelation. It is at this threshold that the next chapter emerges. The global shadow disguised as light, the cult of the persona that seduces the entire world. At some point in history, the sacred becomes spectacle. Carl Jung said that when humans lose touch with the self, they replace the direct experience of God with dead symbols, images, rituals, leaders. The abomination of desolation in its deepest sense is not just a prophetic event. It is the moment when humans worship their own persona, transforming the ego into divinity. It is the modern cult of the self disguised as enlightenment. We live in an age where spirituality has become a performance. We meditate to post, we give to be seen, we speak of love to garner applause. The shadow has learned to use hashtags. And meanwhile, the true temple, that of consciousness, remains in ruins. The world kneels before digital gurus, media saviors, charismatic voices that say, "Follow me, I have the answer." It is the old temptation of power, disguised as light. The abomination of desolation does not begin in Jerusalem. It begins in the human mind when the ego sits on the throne and demands worship. The global persona is a sophisticated mask. It's the archetype of appearance elevated to a planetary scale. Carl Jung saw the persona as the social function of the psyche, useful, necessary, but dangerous when we forget it's just a role. Today, we live in an era where masks have gained autonomy. Profiles, personal brands, public identities, everything revolves around the illusion of control and validation. Spirituality without depth fuels this game. It promises awakening without deconstruction, transcendence without shadow. It's the psychic equivalent of rebuilding the temple on the same corrupted ground, ignoring that the soil needs to be purified first. The cult of the global persona is seductive because it offers immediate meaning. You feel seen, applauded, relevant. But spiritual relevance has never been about visibility. It's about coherence. It's possible to be anonymous in the world and still be a living force of consciousness. It's possible to be socially invisible and spiritually indispensable. And true awakening requires this courage, the courage to disappear. The problem is that the ego, when crowned, is not content with applause. It craves control. This is where the abomination archetype becomes dangerous. When humanity transfers its power of discernment to an external figure, be it political, technological, or spiritual, it creates the perfect environment for the manipulation of collective consciousness. It is the global psyche projecting the self onto a redeeming leader and then suffering from its own illusion. Jung warned, the danger is not technology, but the unconscious human soul operating through it. And this is exactly what we live in, a planet that, in the name of light, accepts total control. The idolatry of the persona mixes with the promise of security, and free will begins to die amidst applause. The collective shadow has found its most sophisticated stage, the digital world. And ironically, it is in this setting of artificial lights that the real darkness begins to grow, but all darkness has a limit. And there comes a point when the sky, tired of noise, decides to turn off all the lights so that the true one can be seen. There are moments when the entire universe seems to hold its breath. This is what Carl Jung would call an instant of archetypal revelation, when the collective unconscious manifests a signal so intense that reality bends. The darkening of the sun, moon, and stars, mentioned in ancient prophecies, is more than an astronomical event. It is a symbolic mirror of the collapse of consciousness. When the lights go out outside, it is because something inside is asking to be seen. Mature spirituality understands that darkness is not punishment, but childbirth. Cosmic silence is the pause that precedes revelation. It is as if the self says, "Now, look at me without distractions." Down, when the brightness of things fades, the human being is forced to see differently. And the curious thing is that in this kind of night, the eyes are no longer useful. It is the heart that begins to see. Every soul goes through this eclipse. Sometimes the sun of self-confidence goes out, the moon of emotion darkens, the stars of reason disappear. And it is in this void that reality appears. The cosmic sign is the supreme metaphor for spiritual transition. Humanity experiences what the individual experiences when they lose everything they believed they controlled. When the ego collapses, the spectacle of internal lights also fades. There are no more certainties, plans, or external saviors, and paradoxically, this is where presence emerges. Carl Jung saw this process as the necessary dissolution for the self to be born into consciousness. The shadow once denied becomes a teacher. Fear, once an enemy, becomes a compass. When the external sun fades, the internal fire must be rekindled, and this is the final test of individuation. It is not a moral test, it is a test of vision. Those who have learned to see with their soul do not despair in the night. They learn to trust the invisible, like the navigator who follows the stars no one else sees. The entire universe is a mirror of this process. Chaos is simply the cosmos reorganizing itself. But there's a detail few realize. Global darkness doesn't come to destroy. It comes to reveal those who truly have their own light. When the false glow of personas fades, only what is essential remains. True spirituality is tested in the darkness. When everything crumbles, those who remain silent, conscious, and present reveal their true inner stature. Carl Jung said that one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The cosmic signal is exactly that, an invitation to make the unconscious visible. The planet, like a great psychic mirror, reflects this collective inner night. And when all seems lost, that will be precisely the moment when true light will manifest, no longer in the stars, but in the awakened consciousness of each being. It is at this point that humanity finally begins to decipher time, to realize that the signs are not catastrophes, but divine language. And it is when this perception matures that the next movement emerges, learning to read the seasons of the spirit with the wisdom of a fig tree that senses summer before seeing it. Nature has always known what humanity has forgotten. Everything has its time. The fig tree, an ancient symbol used by Jesus, is a silent teacher of consciousness and presence. Carl Jung saw in it an archetype of discernment, the wisdom of perceiving signs without needing dates, predictions, or mediators. True spirituality works like this. It reads the internal climate, not the calendar. An awakened soul recognizes summer before the heat arrives because it feels the movement of the sap within itself. And perhaps this is what humanity needs to relearn, the spiritual instinct. Modernity has lost touch with the soul's timing. It wants results in minutes, instant revelations, evolution without process. But the self does not work under pressure. It flourishes at the rhythm of mystery. When consciousness learns to observe rather than control, everything changes. You stop despairing over storms and begin to see them as harbingers of maturity. The secret of the fig tree is simple. It doesn't force summer, it senses it. Reading the seasons of the soul is an art few master, but everyone can learn. It requires sensitivity, silence, and attention, three vanishing virtues. Carl Jung would say this reading is the heart of individuation, because it teaches us to recognize the internal cycles that reflect the movements of the cosmos. There are times of pruning, of shadow, of withdrawal, and there are times of blossoming, of revelation, of expansion. The unconscious, however, wants everything all the time, and that's why it suffers. Spirituality teaches that pain comes from resisting the right timing of things. When you try to harvest the fruit before its time, it turns bitter. It's the same with the soul. Instead of fighting winter, learn to listen to it. Instead of demanding answers, learn to cultivate questions. And when you feel like everything has stopped, remember, the sap has never stopped flowing. The self continues to work even when it seems absent. It is simply putting down deeper roots so that the blossoming lasts longer. The fig tree also teaches us about discernment, the ability to recognize true signs amidst the noise. Today we live surrounded by seasonal prophets, people who interpret spiritual time based on fear, status, or views. But the soul doesn't follow trends. It follows coherence. Reading the season doesn't come from the mind, it comes from presence. It's a listening to the invisible, a fine-tuning between shadow and light. When you become a keen observer of your own cycles, the world begins to align around you. Opportunities appear, relationships transform, patterns reveal themselves. It's the universe responding to clarity. Carl Jung would call this synchronicity, but in the simple language of life, it's simply confirmation that you and the whole are dancing together again. And when this harmony occurs, something greater awakens. An entire generation begins to recognize the pattern, to understand that they live in a time of convergence, the point at which all signs, internal and external, begin to unite as a single movement of the collective soul. There are times when time seems to fold in on itself. It's as if all the loose threads of history, personal and collective, begin to intertwine at an invisible point. Carl Jung would call this synchronicity on a planetary scale, humanity's self attempting to integrate. We are living precisely that moment. Everything that once seemed separate, science and spirituality, the sacred and the profane, the visible and the unconscious, begins to touch, and it is in this contact that the shadow reveals itself. The convergence generation is the one being forced to look at everything at once: environmental crises, psychological collapses, social polarizations, a hunger for meaning. It is a collective birth, and we are both mother and child. Spirituality is no longer a refuge, it is an urgency. This generation feels the call of the self even without knowing its name. It is that strange sensation that something immense is about to happen, and that every choice now carries cosmic weight. The curious thing is that this generation was born surrounded by information, but hungry for wisdom. They grew up with unlimited access to data, but disconnected from presence. And it is precisely this abundance of noise that is forcing a return to inner listening. Carl Jung would say that the collective unconscious, when saturated, creates its own form of correction. It collapses the old system, and that is what we are seeing. The social and emotional structures that sustained centuries of unconsciousness are crumbling because they can no longer support the weight of their own lie. The convergence generation is not an age group. It is a state of consciousness. They are people of all ages who are tired of living half-heartedly. They want purpose, authenticity, coherence. They look at the chaos of the world and intuit that nothing is random, that there is a pattern forming behind the disorder. And this intuition is the breath of the self trying to reorganize the collective psyche. But every convergence requires a turning point, a moment when the collective consciousness must decide between fear and revelation. Carl Jung taught that when the shadow is denied, it dominates, but when it is looked at, it transforms into creative energy. This generation stands at precisely that threshold. Fear says, "The world is ending." Consciousness responds, "No, the world is awakening." The end of an era is not a tragedy. It is a spiritual birth. And what is being born is a more lucid, more present, more whole humanity. But birth requires pain, and it is this pain that many are feeling now. It is the self calling through the crisis, forcing each one to choose to remain asleep or to begin actively participating in the awakening. Because when the pattern finally completes, time ceases to be a warning and becomes revelation. And it is in this revelation that the final movement occurs, the one in which humanity must choose whether to react with fear or walk with awareness in the face of the inevitable. Every great transformation begins within, and that's where the true battlefield reveals itself. Inner preparation isn't about stockpiling certainties, but about making room for presence. Carl Jung said that fear is the emotion that arises when consciousness touches the unknown, and that's precisely why it's the portal to awakening. Fear isn't the enemy, it's the invitation. It points to where the self wants to act. But modern humans have learned to run from it, numbing themselves with distractions, addictions, and theories. Authentic spirituality, however, does the opposite. It teaches us to sit with fear and listen to it until it reveals what truly lies beneath. And almost always, what's hidden isn't a threat, it's power. When you learn to look at fear with awareness, it transforms into a living presence, fuel for individuation. The shadow loses its power when it's seen, and what seemed like chaos reveals itself as a meticulous plan for expansion. Fear is the disguise the self uses to teach courage. Preparing oneself spiritually is, therefore, a work of inner alignment. It's not about complex rituals or distant retreats, but about coherence. It's the simple, the small, the daily, the silent meditation before bed, the reading that awakens discernment, like Carl Jung's The Red Book, which is not for understanding but for feeling. It's the pause before reacting, the breath before speaking, the conscious choice not to feed the noise. True preparation is not for the end of the world, but for the end of the ego as the center of the world. And when this happens, spirituality ceases to be a belief and becomes a state of being. Being prepared is living with an awakened heart, even when everything seems to be falling apart. It's remembering, amidst uncertainty, that the self knows the way. Consciousness does not fear the dark because it recognizes that it is part of the light. And the more the world seems to collapse, the more the awakened soul grows stronger in silence. Ultimately, inner preparation is a choice between two frequencies: fear or awareness. Fear paralyzes. Awareness moves. Fear seeks control. Awareness trusts. And this choice must be made every day, in every gesture, in every thought, in every decision. Spirituality doesn't demand perfection, it demands presence. Carl Jung said, "We are not healed by avoiding the darkness, but by passing through it to the other side." This is what it means to be ready, to allow life to pass through you without losing yourself. When fear strikes, welcome it as a messenger. When the shadow appears, embrace it as a teacher. When silence arrives, embrace it as a temple. Because, in the end, what is coming is not the apocalypse, it is revelation. And those who have prepared themselves within will be the first to recognize the new world emerging outside. The time approaches, but not as a threat, as an invitation. And this invitation echoes now. calling not for panic, but for presence. Now that you've heard all this, tell me, you will continue living on autopilot, waiting for the world to change on its own, or will you start changing the world within yourself? Consciousness does not awaken by chance. It responds to a call. And if you've made it this far, this calling is yours. The shadow you've avoided facing is exactly the key that unlocks the next level of your life. Spirituality is not a refuge. It is a training ground for the self. And the time to prepare is not tomorrow. It's now. So close your eyes for a moment and ask yourself, what inside me still fears what is coming? Because fear only exists until the present sees it. And when you see it with awareness, it dissolves like mist before the sun. You are living at the end of an era, and that is not a threat. It's an invitation to become the kind of person the new world will need. If this message touched something in you, write in the comments what awakened you. And if you want to continue this journey of self-knowledge and deep spirituality, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. There's so much more to come, and the next step may be the most important of your life.